They always say don't take it personally when you get fired, but when it's done in the most smug, patronizing way possible, it is personal. Especially when the guy doing it has no idea he just cut loose the one person who could dismantle his entire career with a single phone call. My name's Daniel Cole. I'm 34 years old, born and raised in the Midwest, the kind of place where your worth is measured by how hard you work and how little you complain. I made my first million before I turned 30, not from luck or inheritance, but by learning how companies move when nobody's watching. I built my wealth quietly, taking small stakes in solid businesses and letting them grow. Over time, those small stakes became majority interests, spread across industries, layered through holding firms, buried under names that meant nothing to the average employee. I didn't want a corner office or a headline. I wanted control, silent, unchallenged, absolute. That's how I ended up working entry-level in a company I already owned, just to see how things looked from the ground floor. I wasn't playing games. I wasn't there for a stunt or to humiliate anyone. I just wanted to see what people were like when the titles were stripped away. So I came in with a fake resume, took a junior analyst role under a borrowed identity, and kept my head down. I wore off-the-rack shirts, brought lunch from home, shared cubicle walls with guys who still believed upper management gave a damn about them. For a while, it felt good. Honest. Like the early years, when I worked 12-hour days just to scrape by. My team was solid. We worked hard. We had each other's backs. That kind of loyalty is rare. And then came the new boss, Jim. Jim was the kind of manager who spoke in LinkedIn quotes and thought leadership podcasts. He had perfect hair, polished shoes, and a voice that got more confident the less he understood. On paper, he was a rising star, brought in to tighten operations and align teams with strategic goals. In reality, he didn't care about the work, only how it made him look. He didn't know the product, the clients, or the people, but he knew how to climb. And the higher he climbed, the more he needed to prove he was the smartest guy in the room. I saw it coming, the way he started sidelining me. First, it was excluding me from meetings I used to lead. Then, passive-aggressive feedback in emails, CCing people who didn't need to be there. The final straw? A poorly executed presentation that I fixed behind the scenes before it tanked a contract. And he took the credit. That's when I knew. Jim saw me as a threat, not because I wanted his job, but because I made his incompetence harder to hide. So he did what weak men in power do. He called me into his office on a Thursday morning, folded his hands like a preacher, and told me I wasn't a good fit. Smiled like he expected me to beg. What he didn't know, what he never thought to consider, was that the moment he fired me, he also made me his boss's boss's boss. I didn't say a word in that moment. I let Jim talk, let him feel in control. I nodded, thanked him for the opportunity, and collected the cardboard box HR handed me like I was some intern who'd spilled coffee on a server. He didn't even walk me out, just waved over his shoulder like I was an afterthought. That was fine. I didn't need a dramatic exit. I'd learned a long time ago, power makes the most noise when it's quiet. I left that day with my dignity intact and the taste of cold revenge already blooming behind my molars. The first thing I did was take a few days to cool off. Not because I was angry, I've been in business long enough to know how to control that, but because I wanted to make sure what came next wasn't about ego. This wasn't going to be a tantrum. This was going to be a lesson. One that started with understanding just how far Jim had let rot take hold in that branch. I called up the executive team at the holding company, men and women who knew me by voice, not title, and scheduled a quiet internal audit. Nothing flashy, no memos, just a few seasoned consultants visiting under the guise of a routine review. I gave them a list of names, files to pull, emails to monitor. I asked them to look closely at the performance reviews, expense reports, and how many good people had quit in the last 6 months. I didn't have to say much. They understood. In the meantime, I went back home to Chicago and slid back into my normal life. My condo on the river. My name on no doors, but all the deeds. I met with my private banker, took some meetings with other companies in the portfolio, even spent a weekend with my brother's kids pretending to be Uncle Danny, the boring office guy. But underneath the calm, I was watching, waiting, and what we found didn't surprise me, but it still burned. Jim wasn't just a bad manager. He was reckless, manipulative, and deeply insecure. He had falsified performance reports to justify firings. Good people, too. Quietly diverted funds from client budgets to pad department efficiency wins that didn't actually exist. He bullied junior staff into silence and promoted yes-men with less experience because they stroked his ego. Worst of all, he presented it all as success. A growing account list, improved KPIs, all neatly packaged in charts designed to confuse instead of clarify. The higher-ups had no reason to doubt him, until now, because now someone with real authority was watching. I kept my distance during the audit. I didn't need to be visible for the trap to spring. Jim still had no idea what was happening behind the curtain. He probably thought firing me had been the end of it. In his mind, I was probably off begging for a LinkedIn recommendation or sulking over drinks with other poor performers. But I wasn't. I was quietly resetting the table he didn't even realize he was sitting at. And soon, I'd be pulling out his chair. 3 weeks after I'd been fired, the first domino fell. A compliance officer from our legal team, again under the guise of routine corporate procedure, requested documentation from Jim's department. Budget justifications, hiring decisions, vendor contracts, the usual stuff. It was all phrased politely, buried in corporate speak, but I knew it would rattle him. Jim wasn't the kind of guy who liked being questioned. He was used to being the one asking questions, controlling the tempo of every meeting, twisting facts into favorable narratives, and now someone above him had started tugging at threads he thought he'd hidden well. I got updates every other day. Quiet pings from the team I trusted. They'd found irregularities in at least 2 vendor contracts, overbilled services, overlapping invoices, payments rerouted through unnecessary intermediaries that looked suspiciously like shell companies. I hadn't authorized those deals, and neither had anyone above him. That told me one of 2 things. Either Jim was lining someone's pockets for favors, or he was pocketing kickbacks himself. Both were violations serious enough to warrant termination, and possibly criminal charges. But I wasn't going to jump the gun. Not yet. I wanted to understand the full scope of his mess, and I wanted to time the fallout just right. Meanwhile, the office chatter started shifting. I still had a few trusted friends working under the radar. People who didn't know my real role, but who liked me enough to stay in touch. They mentioned how tense Jim had become. Paranoid, shorter with people. Apparently, he started calling last-minute meetings to rehash old decisions, trying to paper over gaps in documentation. He even pulled a few folks into his office and asked them if they'd spoken to anyone from corporate. That's when I knew the fear had started to set in. He was sensing the walls close in, but he didn't know where the threat was coming from. That was the beauty of it. This wasn't personal vengeance with fireworks and confrontation. It was a corporate reckoning, cold and clinical. Then came the internal review presentation. It was held over video call, standard protocol. But I was in the room. Not physically, but through the board. When you own a company, you don't need a seat at the table to speak. You are the table. The head of internal compliance presented their findings. Carefully, objectively. But the weight of the language left no room for misinterpretation. Misuse of funds, breach of policy, patterns of retaliation and intimidation. The leadership team didn't say much at first. There's always a moment of stillness when people realize the floor beneath them isn't solid. And then someone asked the key question, "How far up does this go?" That's when I finally spoke. I unmuted my mic, calmly introduced myself, not as Daniel Cole, the junior analyst, but as Daniel Cole, managing partner of the firm that owned every inch of that operation. The silence that followed was the deepest I've ever heard through a speaker. The silence, after I said my name, stretched for almost 5 full seconds. That might not sound like much, but in a meeting room full of executives, 5 seconds is an eternity. You could feel the collective breath being held, every person recalibrating what they thought they knew. Jim wasn't on the call. He hadn't been invited. This wasn't a discussion. It was a verdict being read aloud. When the shock wore off, the head of legal cleared her throat and said, "Mr. Cole, thank you for joining us. I wasn't aware—" She trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. I let her dangle. They'd find out everything they needed to soon enough. I didn't go into detail. I didn't have to. I confirmed my authority, clarified my expectations for next steps, and instructed the board to begin the termination process for any individual found to have violated the company's ethical standards, regardless of their title. That was all I said. No theatrics, no finger-pointing, just cold, clean orders. I logged off immediately after. I didn't want to stick around to hear the chatter. Let them talk. Let them guess how long I'd been watching, and how much more I already knew. The next morning, Jim got called into a meeting with HR and the company's legal counsel. He still thought he could bluff his way out. That was his move. Deflect, deny, spin. He probably figured he could throw someone under the bus, offer to restructure the department, claim ignorance, promise better oversight. But this time no one was interested in excuses. When you lose the confidence of the people above you, the real people above you, it's over. By noon, he was escorted out of the building with a box of his own. No speech, no send-off, just a swift and silent exit through the same door I'd walked out of weeks earlier. I wish I could say it felt satisfying. Part of it did. There's a certain balance to seeing justice served without having to raise your voice. But mostly, it just made me feel tired. Not the physical kind of tired. The kind that sits in your chest. Because for every Jim, there are 100 others. Men who think leadership is about domination, not guidance. Men who punch down and suck up. Men who think the title gives them value instead of the other way around. And those kinds of people don't just damage companies, they damage the people in them. Quietly, slowly, until the good ones either burn out or break. I spent that afternoon going through the exit interviews of the employees who'd left in the last year. There were more than I remembered. Some mentioned Jim by name, others just hinted at a culture shift or a toxic environment. They all added up to the same thing. The system had been bleeding for months before I stepped in. That's the danger of distance. When you own from afar, you can forget what it feels like on the ground. And maybe that's why I came down in the first place. Not just to catch someone like Jim, but to remind myself what leadership really looks like. I spent the next week quietly putting things back together. I didn't announce myself to the wider staff. There was no press release, no surprise walkthrough with security flanking me like I was some corporate messiah. That's not how I operate. Power, when wielded properly, doesn't need a spotlight. Instead, I brought in a new regional director, Sarah Lynn, a no-nonsense operator with a sharp mind and zero tolerance for politics. I'd worked with her at another company years ago and knew she had the integrity and backbone to rebuild from the inside out. I gave her full authority and just one instruction. Make it a place people want to come to work again. Sarah didn't waste time. Within 48 hours, she met with every team, not as a figurehead, but as someone asking questions and listening like it mattered. She reopened development budgets that had been slashed, reinstated training programs. Most importantly, she invited feedback, real feedback, and protected the people who gave it. Some employees cried in those first one-on-ones. That hit me hard. I'd underestimated how much damage a bad boss could do when no one's watching, and how long that damage could linger after they're gone. Meanwhile, I kept tabs from the background. Not because I didn't trust Sarah, I did, but because I needed to see it through. I checked in with a few of the junior analysts I used to work alongside. One of them, Marcus, met me for coffee outside the office. He still didn't know who I really was. He just thought I was a guy who'd gotten the short end of the stick and landed on his feet somewhere else. Over a worn wooden table and 2 black coffees, he told me how things had changed since Jim left. "People actually talk again," he said. "We don't flinch every time someone gets called into a meeting. It feels lighter." That was the moment it all clicked for me. Revenge hadn't been the point. Not really. Yes, I wanted Jim out. Yes, I wanted accountability. But what I truly wanted, what I needed, was to make sure the good people who'd stuck around had a chance to breathe again. Corporate culture isn't built on mission statements or glass office walls. It's built in the cracks, in how managers treat interns, in who gets credit, in who feels safe enough to speak. For months, those cracks had been filled with fear. Now, we were cleaning them out. I was just about to wrap up my involvement when I got an unexpected email. It was from Laura, one of the senior project leads I used to share a cubicle wall with. She'd always been sharp, but cautious. She wrote, "I don't know who pulled the strings behind the scenes, but whoever it was, thank you. We were drowning, and someone finally threw us a rope." I read that line 3 times. Then I leaned back in my chair, closed my eyes, and let myself feel something I hadn't in a long time. Peace. A month later, I visited the office one last time. Not in disguise, not with any agenda, just as myself, Daniel Cole, quiet owner, former analyst, and someone who still remembered what it felt like to be just another guy trying to do his job with dignity. I didn't schedule anything, didn't walk in with a clipboard or entourage. I just stepped into the lobby, signed in at the front desk, and took the elevator up to the floor I used to call home. It was different, brighter somehow. Not in lighting, but in energy. The kind of subtle shift you only notice when the weight of fear has been lifted. I stayed off to the side, watching people I'd worked beside now move through their day with ease. No more hushed conversations, no more glances over shoulders, just focus, laughter, light chatter by the coffee machine. Sarah spotted me from the hallway and waved me into her office. "I figured you might show up eventually," she said with a smile. "You want the numbers or the mood first?" I chuckled. "The mood." She didn't hesitate. "We're healing. And they know someone up top actually gives a damn now." That was enough for me. On my way out, I passed by the cubicle where I'd sat not so long ago. A younger guy had taken my spot. I didn't know his name, but he looked just like I did when I first started out. Focused, hopeful, not yet jaded. I wanted to say something to him, but I didn't. He didn't need a speech. He just needed space to grow without fear, to do his job in a place that wouldn't crush his spirit. And thanks to a few moves made in silence, he'd have that chance. I got in the elevator, alone, and pressed the button for the lobby. As the doors closed, I saw the faint reflection of myself in the metal. Older now, maybe a little more tired than I'd like to admit, but still here. Still fighting, in my own quiet way, for something better. This wasn't about proving anything anymore. It wasn't even about punishment. It was about legacy. About making sure that the places I owned, the people I led, whether they knew it or not, were protected from the kind of rot that so easily spreads when no one's paying attention. Outside, the air felt clean, crisp with the kind of cool that wakes you up. I walked to my car, got in, and pulled away without looking back. There was no need. The damage had been undone. The lesson had been taught, and the right people were finally in charge.